皆様こんにちは。ただいまよりロシアセッションを始めたいと思い。
We will be starting the Russian session. We're ahead of schedule, but I think all of us are here. So at this point, like this regional session on Russia. Today there is a simultaneous interpretation being provided. But the interpretation will be between Japanese and English. Japanese will be heard on channel 1, and channel 2 will give you the English language. And our moderator today is Dr. Shimotomai of Valdai and Kanagawa universities. And from Sasakawa, Mr. Abiru, Taisuke. And from Valdai Club, Mr. Anton Bespalov. And former ambassador to Japan, Mr. Panov, a familiar face to you. And I'm going to give the microphone to Mr. Shimotomai, ask him to serve as an MC. Thank you for that introduction. Shimotomai is my name. I work for the Kanagawa University. There are 4 regional sessions, US, China, Europe. But comparatively, we are in the one stage above compared to those 3 panels, so that indicates the level of expertise and the special importance of this particular session. Now, we are going to focus on Japan-Russia relationship, inviting comments from our speakers from different perspectives that they represent. But if I may say a few words, with the great help of Ambassador Panov, who have worked on the parallel history of Japan and Russia. And if you think about the relationship between Japan and Russia, it's not very well known, but there has been strong involvement, engagement with the global world history, because in the 20th century, the world history more or less began with the war between Japan and Russia. Then there was a Second World War. Some academics are now arguing that it began in the Mohan and in 1939, and it ended as a war between Japan and Russia, because it's ended between Japan and Russia, the 2 nations, Japan and Russia. And they were supposedly neutral to each other in a quasi-alliance relationship, but they were not able to handle the situation in the aftermath of the war. And therefore, once the war was over, we are now in the 74th year of that period, but in the peace treaty discussions, we are renewing the Guinness Book of World Records in terms of length that it's taken to revisit the peace treaty, yet to be achieved. And that being the situation, as far as the relationship is concerned with Mr. Abe and Mr. Putin's government's administration, I think there are a lot of new developments that we've seen. And previous to that, it had been very rare for the 2 leaders of 2 countries to meet. Maybe summit would take place every decade or so. In 1956 once, then in 1972, and the top leader of Russia came to Japan in 1991, and Mr. Nakasone, who unfortunately left us just the other day. You know, in Japan, wedding ceremonies are open to only the invitees, but funerals can be attended by anyone. So he went to the funeral with Chernakov, and he met Mr. Gorbachev, who was appointed to the secretary position just a while before. So compared to that, Mr. Abe and Mr. Putin, they are the leaders of the same generation, the post-war generation, so to speak. And Mr. Putin, about 20 years ago, but at this time he was appointed as a candidate for the president. And Mr. Prime Minister also is the longest Prime Minister in his office, longer than his cohort from Yamaguchi Prefecture, Mr. Katsura, in the early history of Japan. And because of their length of in the office, they have met 27 times altogether. Of course, with Mr. Xi Jinping, is met 30 times. But in any case, this is a new turn of the event, a new phase of the bilateral history between Japan and Russia. But at the same time, there are a lot of twists and turns in this journey. Now, we have panelists here. I don't think I have to introduce them in detail. But we have Ambassador Panov. He is the top person of the Mugimono, which celebrated 75th anniversary recently in the celebratory event. I found that Mr. Panov is a person of high respect and admiration in the ministry, even more so than the foreign minister. So in the ministry, I was reminded again of the high status that he occupies in the foreign ministry. He was ambassador to Japan and Korea, and also Norway as well, and also vice minister of the ministry. Then we have next to him from the Sasakawa Foundation, Mr. Abiru, chief researcher. Mr. Abiru believes that Mr. Putin always raises issues which are most difficult to address. Is very known for participating in this conference. Mr. Kasparov, this meeting surrounding Mr. Putin Valdai conference. He's a deputy editor of this conference. So in that capacity, he's being with us today. So we have three panelists, and I have four questions to them, and I'd like to invite them to spend maybe 7 to 10 minutes answering those questions. It's up to you to give priority or focus to any of the three questions. And then after that, I'll give you 3 more minutes for supplementary comments, or maybe I'll ask further additional questions. Then, time allowing, at the end, I will open the process to the floor and invite questions and comments from the floor. So firstly, my first question. As I said before, I stated some of the reasons why that between Mr. Abe and Mr. Putin, this relationship between Japan and China has been intensifying. What is your view? What is your evaluation of this relationship? What's the outcome that, if there might be any outcome? And also in terms of domestic political situation of your countries, why is it the case that Japan is now trying to intensify relationships with Russia, and Russia trying to do the same vis-a-vis Japan? Why is it? Are there any domestic political reasons? Secondly, international environment surrounding this bilateral relationship. As we know, in the second term of Mr. Abe government, immediately after that, there was a crisis in Ukraine, and that exacerbated the relationship between Russia and the United States. People refer to that as new Cold War that began. On top of that, with the exacerbation, aggravating of the Sino-American relationship, there has been improvement, it seems, in Sino-Russian relationship. Some people are arguing that there is an emergency of a quasi-alliance between China and Russia. And I'd like to invite you to give us your view, your take on that idea. And the third, my large question is, from a global perspective, if you look at East Asia, we're talking about Indo-Pacific sort of a concept, particularly Japan and the United States advocating this idea of an Indo-Pacific initiative and open and free international relationships being pursued by Japan and the States. But then in the end, there is a large Eurasian initiative and One Road, One Belt initiative, China. So that is building up a new sort of a geopolitical reality in front of our eyes. So on one hand, there is Indo-Pacific, and is it possible for Indo-Pacific to collaborate and cooperate with Eurasian region? Is it a zero-sum game, or is it a win-win sort of a situation? Is it possible? And this may be an unnecessary question for Russia, but you are in Japan, so you should have expected this question. It's about peace treaty. And some of you may be hearing this for the first time. Last year, Prime Minister Abe, in November, switched his policy for negotiation completely. So now he was ready to base the process on the agreement in 1956, focusing only on 2 islands, which is 7% of the landmass of the islands altogether. And he said that from now on, the focus of a discussion negotiations will be on these 2 islands. But this year, nothing has happened. No development seems to be taking place. And Foreign Minister recently, Mr. Motegi, the fact that he's new also may be the reason for this current situation. Anyway, so I've asked the 4 questions. Whichever questions you would like to focus, it's up to you. But Ambassador Panov, I'd like to give you the first opportunity, please. I have to apologize. Thank you. I'd like to speak in Japanese. And I was expecting that I will be participating in an international sort of a conference, but looking at the composition of the audience, I see a lot of Japanese who are much more of an expert on Japan-Russia relationship than myself. Normally, in order to prepare my presentations, I don't prepare any papers because I'm a lazy person. But for Ideologue today, because this is a very large, important event, I did prepare something, so I'm not going to speak in English. I will do so because I don't want my work of labor go to waste, hopefully.
So what world do we have now? Some are saying that, it is not a second Cold War. I think it is second Cold War, but it has its peculiarities in comparison with the first Cold War. First, in confrontation with the United States, Russia is alone. The United States has allies. Russia has not. Of course, Belarus, but, it depends how to estimate our relations with Belarus. But really, in comparison with Cold War I, when it was 2 blocks, now we have 1 bloc, leader is United States, and only 1 Russia in confrontation. Big important countries, China, India, Brazil, not participating in Cold War II. Of course, China is emerging as a potential member of Cold War II, but I will explain later how it may evolve. There is no ideology conflict. It's not necessary to explain. No global rivalry of two social economic systems. The world is not two-polar but multipolar. Main characteristic of the Second Cold War. First of all, revival of the stereotypes of the period of Cold War I. Image of the enemy is revived. In Russia, it's a growing feeling that Russian people are in the fortress under siege. Anti-Russian propaganda in the United States is even higher than during Cold War I. In Russia, we see growing anti-American public mood. In general, propaganda prevailing over strategic analysis in realistic, sober evaluations in both sides. Second, economic wars. The aim of the United States is to isolate Russian economy, to inflict maximum damage, to prevent integration in world economy, and finally to weaken Russia to the most low level. One more. Almost completely cessation of normal diplomatic relations between Washington and Moscow. Visa wars, absence of minimum trust, etc., etc. Fourth, arms race. Breakdown of the system of the control for the most powerful and dangerous weapons systems is before us. No more so-called red lines for both sides. Russia is still nuclear superpower, but not a superpower as USSR was. Consequences of the situation for Russia. First of all, Russian economy is suffering, not only because of sanctions policy, but because in general Russian economy is not developing well. Sanctions, well, when we calculate sanctions, the result is minus 1% GNP for Russia. But it's maybe not so big, but in general, Russian economy now in stagnation. One reason is that complicated situation on world energy market influences Russian economy quite high. Now about relations with China and the United States. Trump administration regards China, along with Russia, as countries challenging the existing international order. Well, of course, the question is, what kind of international order? Domination of the United States is one thing, multipolar world another. But when I analyzed Trump program when he was in process of election for the presidency, it was clear that for Trump, Russia was not threat, was not enemy. And it's clear because, well, what is Russia for United States? Enemy, well, in the sense that Russia can destroy United States by nuclear arms, but such war is unimaginable. Economically, Russia is weak, cannot damage United States. Ukraine, what is Ukraine? For United States, no one maybe knows where is it Ukraine and what does it mean. If Europe would like to have this Ukraine problem to press Russia, okay, let's them do this. but not for United States. For United States, it was clear that one country only can damage United States. It's China. China, as in view in Washington, it is a view in Washington that China started the geopolitical struggle for supremacy. As a first step is using its military and economic power to expand its sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific. Next step will be reform of the world economic and finance system to obtain leading role and to push aside the United States. Third step, to use ideology to create common destiny for mankind. I listened very carefully what yesterday was discussions. Those who was at the discussion know that it was even different points raised by representative of China military and representative of China diplomatic circles. But I believe only what leaders are saying and what are in papers. So Chairman Xi said that socialism would inevitably vanquish capitalism. Of course, it would be a long historical process. For a time being, China should prepare for a long-term cooperation with Western developed countries and struggle between the two social systems. It's the same what Soviet leaders said, I would like to remind you. And especially Khrushchev once said that Soviet Union or socialism, communism would bury capitalism, and we will be present at their funeral. So the United States is trying to contain the rise of China. In many aspects, Washington is late. Simply, and yesterday when listened to what was said, more and more convinced that the United States simply doesn't know what to do with China. Now, the United States withdraw from Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. One reason, it was clear, said it's China threat with the same kind of weapons. Now, the United States has a free hand to deploy surface-launched intermediate-range missiles to counter China in Asia, in allied countries, Republic of Korea and Japan. Secretary of Defense, Esper, said in August that the United States is hoping to deploy new ground-based intermediate-range missiles in Asia sooner than later. China already warned Japan and Republic of Korea that their relations with Beijing will deteriorate if they allow the United States to base such missiles on their soil. Definitely, such move will be regarded by Russia as a threat to its security and will encourage Moscow and Beijing to move toward even more close military cooperation. Military cooperation between Russia and China is progressing. As long as the United States-Russia and the United States-China confrontation persists, China and Russia will have mutual national interest to withstand the United States. Russia and China now have more complex joint military exercises in different areas from South China Sea to the Baltic, started joint air patrol in the Sea of Japan. It's not alliance. Both have different international agendas and interests, but common aim is to establish a new balance of power. Russia understands growing asymmetry in Russia's political and economic relations with China. China did not approve Russian actions in Ukraine. Russia is officially neutral on the problem of the South China Sea. But Russia does not see the growing imbalance in relations with China as a threat to its security or national interests. President Putin several times stressed that One Belt, One Road and Big Eurasia initiative do not contradict each other, but supplement one another. Both sides started to coordinate projects included in their initiatives. Now about conception of free and open Indo-Pacific. Prime Minister Abe was the first who invented this conception with the aim to create free open zone of interconnected economies. But now President Trump is the most active in promoting this idea, but stressing, first of all, not economy, but defense and military aspects. It's not clear what to expect from American strategy in the Indo-Pacific except anti-China containment policy. In August this year, Secretary of Defense Esper, in his speech at Naval War College, called the Indo-Pacific theater our priority theater and stressed the intention to expand base locations in the Pacific to build capable partners and strengthen the deterrence. China's response was such. In July, China released a white paper on national defense, and in this paper, the United States characterized as strengthening its Asia-Pacific military alliances and reinforcing military deployment and intervention, adding complexity to regional security. Despite American efforts to promote the idea, American influence and engagement with Asian region, including in the Pacific, are in relative decline. And I don't see possibility that this conception will be progressing, especially because many countries in the region, they are not interested to spoil relationship with China. And finally, about relations with Russia and Japan. I think, well, there will be more questions about this, so I will stop here and I will answer questions later.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Given the time constraint, yes, I will not ask questions now. And now, I'd like to move to Mr. Ambel, or Professor Ambel. Thank you. As Professor Shimotomai mentioned, it was in October 2016. That was 2 months before President Putin came to Japan. And then in October 2018, and that's in September, President Putin attended East Economic Forum in Vladivostok, met with Prime Minister Abe, suggesting that they should enter into the peace treaty without any assumptions. Well, that was a public announcement made by President Putin in Vladivostok. So it was 1 month later, in October of the same year, in 2018. On 2 occasions, I had an opportunity to ask questions to President Putin about peace treaty on the occasion of the Valdai conference. And the keywords were highlighted in that interaction. That is, between Russia and Japan, the lack of trust. That was a keyword that was mentioned. On the first occasion, that was in 2016. In the near future, peace treaty with a solution over territorial issues, whether there is any realistic possibility or at least environment could be conducive enough? That was a question that I asked, and then first President Putin mentioned we should not set time limit, and also he mentioned further that there is not sufficient trust between two countries that would lead to a peace treaty, and therefore it was essential to first generate trust. That was his answer. Then in 2018, at the time of the forum in Vladivostok, all of a sudden, President Putin mentioned by the end of the year, we should work on conclusion of peace treaty without assumptions, and therefore, in 2018, in October, I asked the following question. That is, for President Putin, in making such a statement about conclusion of peace treaty, which is compared to what he stated 2 years before, that is, between Russia and Japan, there is not sufficient trust that is conducive to peace treaty. So compared to that statement, what is the relationship between the two? That is a question that I asked. What I mean is that now that he calls for a conclusion of peace treaty, does it mean that there is sufficient trust between two countries? Or is it something else? So that was the intent behind my question. And I have to say, the answer was the latter. That is, the sufficient trust is yet to be generated between two sides, and therefore, as Mr. Ambassador back in late 1990s was deeply involved in a situation where territorial issues and solution to them should be just the delayed for some time so that they can conclude a kind of the intermediate treaty that is between Russia and China in 2011. The Friendship and Good Neighbor Treaty was concluded, and then 3 years later, the territorial dispute between the two was finally resolved, and that was a case that President Putin referred to. And therefore, whether what he intended was the intermediate treaty or whether it is friendship treaty, whatever, if it is the friendship cooperation treaty, if such is concluded, then that would lead to generating more trust, eventually leading to conclusion of peace treaty by solving territorial dispute. So that was a response given by President Putin. But to begin with, between Japan and Russia, the lack of trust is because of what? What is the root cause of that? I believe, and that holds a key to interpreting current situation regarding territorial dispute from Japan's point of view. At the end of World War II, what was experienced back then, as described as historical issues, resulted in lack of trust by the Japanese toward Russians. It's quite understandable from Japan's point of view, but then what is the root cause for Russians to state that there is no trust between Russia and Japan? That is in terms of question over independence or dependence on the United States by Japan. That is to say, whether they have a distrust toward Japan. Rather than that, it is more about within the framework of Japan-US alliance and actions taken by Japan and the Russians cast a question about independence on the part of Japan. In other words, the lack of trust between Russia and the United States is also influencing the relationship between Japan and Russia. Looking back, it was in 2012, the end of 2012, when Prime Minister Abe's administration for the second term was started. And what was the year like in 2012? That was when President Putin was re-elected as president. That was in May 2012, and at the same time, Russia established Far East Development Ministry. And then in September, the APEC summit was hosted in Vladivostok. And then in October, at the time of the statement at the beginning of the year, the victory in 21st century was referred to. In other words, year 2012 was the year when Eastern rebalancing policy was put forward as a formal policy by Russia. In March same year, as I see the journalist from Asahi newspaper, it was in March 2012 when President Putin gathered generous and then he proposed to settle the territorial dispute between two countries as a tie. So think about this year 2012 from Russia's point of view. That was the year when Eastern rebalancing policy started by Russia. And talking about that policy, it was put forward as formal policy in 2012. But if you take a closer look, it dates back to earlier years under the surface. It goes back to 2009. That was the year after global financial crisis that hit the world in fall 2008, resulting in devastation of European economy. But then Russia successfully redeveloped its economy by huge investment. And ever since, they started to advocate active the policies toward Asia. So back in 2009, the first initiative that was proposed by Russia was about the Chesnefti and Rosnefti had the loan from Chinese bank for a 20-year oil supply contract.
And also, China would become the largest trade partner of Russia, exceeding Germany in 2009 in that year. So the Russian Eastern rebalancing, more or less, the pivotal point was the Lehman crisis, one could argue. But another thing is that at that time in Asia, it was not that Russia wanted to depend only on China, not yet. So, and also there were some other interesting developments in 2009. Toward the end of the year in 2009, interestingly, Vietnam signed a contract to buy submarines from Russia. And also in the next year, Vietnam also, in the East Asian Summit, led the simultaneous participation and accession of the United States and Russia at the same time. And also as far as Japan was concerned, Japan took actions at about that time in 2009, in May. Prime Minister Putin visited Japan, but 2 months later, in July of 2009, Mr. Aso, the then Prime Minister, and President Medvedev, I think Mr. Shimotomai was there, started a trilateral experts meeting between Japan, the United States, and Russia. Importantly, it was initiated by the government. It was an intergovernmental initiative, meaning that at that time, Russia was shifting in favor of the East, intensifying relationship with China. So Japan and Vietnam, both countries wanted to bring the United States and Russia together. Two countries were working on this. And Russia accepted those two initiatives at the time. The Russians were willing. And the final report of this Trilateral Commission came out in 2012. So during those times, Mr. Abe's diplomacy vis-a-vis Russia began at that time. And this was a time when Japan and Russia wanted to see the relationship well balanced, including the relationship with the United States, because they're concerned about China, and that was the precondition assumptions they all had that led to the launch of the Russian diplomacy by Mr. Abe in 2009. But then came the Crimean situation, the situation fluctuated, and then came Mr. Trump in the American presidency, and the situation was further shaken. So efforts were made to improve the relationship with Russia, but due to the domestic situation, he was not able to do this. Mr. Trump and the sanctions were adopted by the Congress, so the relationship deteriorated. Therefore, as Mr. Ambassador and Mr. Shimotomai mentioned earlier, this was also added by the aggravation of the relationship between China and United States. That's why there's suddenly the closing up of the relationship between China and Russia. The strategic partner in the spectrum, being a strategic partner in a military alliance, they are certainly not a military alliance. If we prefer a military alliance, there will be mutual obligations. That's not something that is wanted by Russia or China. So it's not a military alliance, but in that spectrum, I think it's getting closer to this side. So initially, what Mr. Abe's government was thinking when they started the Russian diplomacy, they had assumptions about the international fundamentals, but the fundamentals have changed very significantly over time. That's why now this negotiation between Japan and Russia is stalling. So that's the historical sort of stumble block that has caused this stalling situation in the negotiations. And lastly, I'd like to invite Anton to give us his view. Probably you've studied in Poland, so maybe European perspective as well. Also, the French president now is saying that NATO is brain dead. He tried to intervene in the Ukrainian situation. Or he is trying to. So perhaps commenting on Mr. Macron's efforts as well, perhaps.
I'm really thrilled to be speaking of two such distinguished panelists, and what reassures me is the fact that both Shimotomai-sensei and Abiru-san are good friends of my institution, the Valdai Club, and coupled with the presence of a Russian ambassador, it almost makes me feel like at home. So let me start. I'd like to start with the Cold War issue and link it to the topic of this conference. Yesterday we had very interesting discussions about whether a rules-based liberal international order can exist. And what we heard were almost exclusively Western perspectives of this issue. So I'm in a strange position of presenting non-Western perspectives. And the perspective is as follows. It was a little bit touched upon by Monsieur de Montréal, who served as an advocate of non-Western views, and I'd like to develop on that. So what we had during the Cold War was a set of two or three maybe rules-based international orders. One for the Western world, the other for the so-called Soviet bloc, and the third, in some sense, for the third world. So what we saw was the two sets of international rules could coexist. They existed, each of them in their own sphere. When the Soviet bloc collapsed, it was largely perceived in the West as the collapse of the whole system. and a victory of the liberal order. So I think it's a false perception that the liberal international order triumphed. Here I agree with Monsieur de Montreal that it did not triumph. It continued to exist in the part of the world where it had existed and where it had been successful and brought prosperity to many countries, including Japan. But it would be a mistake to believe that the other countries would automatically embrace it. And here we come to China. So there is one thing that surprises me very much in Western thinking about China, about its aspiration to become a major power, that it was like no one expected that China would have such aspirations. The peaceful rise of China was largely due to the West. It was facilitated by the West, first as an attempt to counterbalance the Soviet Union, and then when the Western companies found the benefits of using Chinese labor and Chinese productive capabilities. So, for some reason, the West thought that China would put up with its role as the world's factory without claiming for a bigger role in international politics as its economic influence grew. In Russia, we were not surprised by this turn of developments, because Russia had got used to coexisting with another system of values, another system of rules. And for Russia, the existence of an alternative to the liberal international order, which does exist but only in a part of the world, and which is efficient only in one part of the world, was no surprise. So now going to the Indo-Pacific issue. I heard different expert opinions on this from different countries. My impression until yesterday was that there are several visions of Indo-Pacific. The most belligerent one originates from the United States. My feeling is that the United States hijacked the Indo-Pacific agenda from Premier Abe, who first proposed it in 2007 on his visit to India. The original Indo-Japanese concept of Indo-Pacific was not about military containment of China. And this is my impression from the presentations of Japanese speakers, that they're very cautious in how these plans could affect China and how they could change its behavior and stoke its fears that it's being encircled and so on. Another version of Indo-Pacific exists in Indo-Pacific, in Indonesia, where I was only three days ago. So the Southeast Asian experts were very much more for peaceful Indo-Pacific without the military component in it. And next comes the American version, which, as I saw at yesterday's discussions, was very much about containment of China. So it all depends to which extent the other countries, Japan, India, and Australia, support this American view. And when President Putin was asked last year at the Valdai conference what's Russia's attitude to Indo-Pacific, he said that Russia supports all kinds of integration, all kinds of cooperation agreements, as long as they don't evolve into military blocs and alliances. Because if there is any word that Russia has aversion for, it's alliance and bloc thinking. Next we come to the issue of trust, which Abiru-san mentioned. So for Japan, the liberal international order is synonymous with prosperity and security. This is not the case for Russia, and I think for China too. For Russia, the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union are strongly associated with economic trouble and deterioration of quality of living, not with prosperity. So this is not automatically perceived as a good, this way of doing things in the liberal international order sphere. So China, for its part, used the liberal order for its own benefits. It allowed China to grow peacefully, but China did not want to change domestically. And it's also the big elephant in the room. Why did the West think that China would inevitably take on democratic standards and would democratize itself? So, in fact, there is, as Ambassador Panov said, there is a really communist state, although it accepted some capitalist features, creating a socialism with Chinese specifics, which continues to be successful and which poses an alternative. So now we come to the issue of Russo-Japanese ties and the results of the numerous meetings between Premier Abe and President Putin. Well, I think the main result of these meetings is creating a very special atmosphere. Prime Minister Abe is known for establishing good personal relationships, and he relies a lot on them. And I think it works. It may be not as efficient as one might expect, but still there is another climate in Russian-Japanese ties. And I think it should be maintained after the leaders change, because historically Russian-Japanese relations have been marred by a very strong degree of distrust, and we must overcome that. Thank you very much.
どうもありがとうございました。最初は
Thank you very much. I originally intended to ask for 10-minute remarks followed by 3-minute additional remarks, but all the speakers gave us such a conclusive statement, discussion, which require no supplementary remarks on my part, and therefore, rather than that, I'd like to ask the floor. We have 25 minutes left. If you have any questions to those three panelists, if you have any questions or comments, and for the record, please state your name and affiliation before stating a question. Yes, gentleman in the front row. Sato of Kyoto. My question is to Ambassador Panov. Allow me to speak in Japanese today. I think it was last week that the Foreign Minister Lavrov came to Japan, and the U.S.-Japan military and political alliance and security treaty seems to have been reflected in his comment, stating that that is a stumbling block of peace treaty conclusion between Russia and Japan. If that is really the case, and then for Russia and Japan, we can never expect conclusion of peace treaty. The reason is because for Japan, alliance with the United States is something that Japan cannot afford to abolish. That is not realistic at all. So what is your view, Ambassador? Do you think Russia can do without a peace treaty between Japan and Russia, or the Russia waits until the U.S.-Japan alliance treaty is abolished? First, I share the same feeling. That is to say, under current circumstances, there is no prospect about peace treaty conclusion. Of course, I'm not versed in what is going on inside the negotiation process, but looking from outside, it appears that the negotiation is not moving forward, and there are two major stumbling blocks. One, as you may know, for Russia, they consider that before transferring the two islands to Japan, Russia regards the territory that became territory of Russia after the war should be recognized as the former territory of Russia. For Japan, they can't afford to admit that. That is, after conclusion of peace treaty, and then the two islands should be transferred to Japan, and then Japan may recognize the rest as territory of Russia. And yet, that's a discrepancy of views that exists at the very beginning of negotiation. But more than that, there is more significant barrier or stumbling block that is about alliance between Japan and the United States. As to the foreign minister's remarks, I also read that. Of course, for foreign minister, he is an expert in territorial issues. Reading his remarks, I was wondering to what extent he knows about territorial issues. That is to say, if his words were literally reported, then, according to him, back in 1956, for USSR, military presence of the United States in Japan, as long as U.S. bases are in Japan, USSR could not return those two islands to Japan. And that is incorrect because back in 1956, as you may know, Japan-US alliance already existed. Therefore, around 1955-56, if you read record of negotiation, USSR never referred to U.S. military base in Japan. And then after the negotiation, as long as Okinawa is not returned back to Japan, USSR did not intend to return its islands to Japan. That was back in 1957, 1958. Those remarks were repeated. And then after that, in 1960, according to USSR, on a formal basis, in fact, they made such a formal statement. That is, now that U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was concluded, and then with that, the remarks, the promise made about the islands before that are now defunct. And to me, that is illogical. That sounds somewhat inconsistent with what has been the case. Just taking a part of the document and try to deny something, that is not acceptable. And then during USSR or since the beginning of Russia, yes, there were some remarks made on a formal basis about those documents, treaties. But then I'd like to ask why Foreign Minister Lavrov once again referred to that and stating that is the major reason. That is because they are not prepared to sign a peace treaty with Japan. Why is that? They want concession from Japan. It may be some new concession. Negotiation is negotiation. And therefore, in an interest to get some concession, they created such a stumbling block so that they can get concession that they want. That may be the case, but such a way of negotiation does exist if it may be the reason behind foreign minister's statement, and realistically they don't expect actually the abolishing U.S.-Japan treaty. And such is meaningless, but they just want reconfirmation from Japan. That is, there is such an alliance relationship that does exist. And yet, U.S. military base does not pose any threat against Russia. That's a kind of commitment, in one way or another, to be included in the treaty. That may be the intent behind. At present, within territory of Japan, United States has an intention to deploy intermediate-range missiles. If such is deployed, then that can pose a threat against Russia. That's crystal clear. Well, at least that is the judgment, conclusion made by Russia in view of that. And therefore, to prevent that, that may be the reason why Foreign Minister made such a remark. But if you reflect upon reality, in my view, first, Japan should turn to Russia and ask the following question. If Japan recognizes this belongs to Russia as a territory, then based upon treaty, Japan demonstrates that U.S.-Japan security treaty or U.S. presence in Japan do not pose any threat to Russia. If such reaffirmation and confirmation commitment could be made by Japan, and then whether Russia is willing to conclude a peace treaty or not. If you ask such a question to Russia, then the outlook or prospect of conclusion of treaty may be clearer. So if I may repeat again, as of now, I don't think the peace treaty conclusion is comes to reality. Thank you.
So thank you for this.
In English. 日本語の方が do you prefer? Okay, so
But I look to your institution.
of course, okay. I'm working for the Japan Society for Security and Crisis Management, and I've been a security advisor to the governmental institutes in terms of cybersecurity. And I've been a chair of the Russian working group here in Japan. So I regularly give some briefing on Russian diplomacy and information security. So on and so on. So my question is, I have two questions. One is to Ambassador, and the other question is to my Russian colleague. So Bespalov. So let me start with more difficult question towards you, Ambassador. You mentioned clearly that U.S. has been sort of penetrating. Or not penetrating, maybe but anti-Russian, like a disinformation, propaganda. But what about vice versa? have you recognized any sort of propaganda towards Japan, more about like anti-US propaganda from Russian side? If that's so, please tell me. And the other question is much brighter questions. I have seen the very much specific collaboration between Russia and Japan for the startups. Now, there are startups, do you know startups, right? And there has been already 18 cases, including still ongoing discussion. And let me congratulate you, I mean, both of us, I think, because Putin decided to focus on the digitalized economy last year, April 20, last year. So the fostering startups would be the key to accelerate digitalized economy in Russia, I think. But there are some challenges, to implement more from the Russian side. So do you think that you can address them easily? For example, you have to have more, more funding to support the SEMs, small and medium enterprises, because they need more funding from, the government. And they don't have very much, systemized, probably, infrastructure yet. So I hope that, because some of the Japanese IT companies mentioned that, they want, there is a huge potential among Russian IT companies because you have a, historical, super DNA for, mathematics and science and for that. So I hope that we could make together, further. Thank you.
ちょっと司会の不手際もありまして、まだご。
Apologize for the inefficiency of the chair. So, how many hands did I see before? Maybe I'll ask all the questions before inviting our panelists to answer the questions, because we only have 10 minutes left. So, questions first, Mr. Togo. Thank you, Togo, Kyoto University of Industry. Mr. Abiru and Mr. Shimotomai, my questions is for the two of you. Ambassador Panov suggested what Japan should be doing. I think that's this. Japan should be straightforward, asking Mr. Putin what's he's trying to do. Ask that question. But if Japan were to throw such a straightforward question, Japan has to be ready. And the preparations are called for. What is missing is Japan's position in the international situation. How we can leverage, take use, shall I say, of the Russia. Is Japan seriously tackling that? I don't know if the government is even doing that. But in terms of the Japanese population, I didn't participate in the meeting yesterday. But Japan's move against this relationship between the United States and China, well, we can leverage strategically the presence of Korea and Russia vis-a-vis Japan faces in terms of relationship between Russia and China and the United States. As Mr. Panov wrote this about in Chuo Koron, I think Japan's initiatives are very low-key. Unless we came out to Mr. Putin very straightforward, I think we'll only be left with regret, having done nothing. So we're going to accept all the questions first. All right, thank you. Komaki of Asahi newspaper. My question is for the two Russian panelists, briefly, and about the relationship between China and Russia. Mr. Abiru talked about this relationship. It's in between strategic and alliance relationship, moving in favor of the alliance kind of relationship. But it's said that Russia is going to end up becoming a junior partner vis-a-vis China. So your frank view about this view, please? This prospect, please? All right. So questions were asked, two questions to the Russian speakers and Mr. Abiru, and also I received one question each. I'll respond if only time allows. So first, reversing the order, Mr. Abiru first. Can you answer the question? All right, thank you. Ambassador Togo, your point is very important, I believe. Because, as I said before, now, looking at Japan-Russia relationship, the biggest problem is there's no strategic vision about the future. There's no alignment of the visions between the two countries. Back in 2009 and 2012, between 2009 and 2009, we had repeated trilateral meetings, and I think they were identifying certain directions to pursue. That's why we started negotiations, but that sort of collapsed. So once again, what we need is strategic dialogue. There's a need for us to have such a strategic dialogue, and one key to doing that is, as mentioned by Mr. Shimotomai earlier, Japan is working on this Indo-Pacific idea with a vision, and there is also a greater Eurasian vision of Russia. There's two visions. Where the interests of the two initiatives overlap or maybe divergent, I think that's something that we can start discussions with, discussing these two initiatives. Realize the similarities, realize the divergences. In Valdai conference this year, the Indian participants raised the questions about Indo-Pacific concept, and the Japanese participant, Mr. Hosoya of Keio University, asked a question about the Indo-Pacific. Question was directed to Mr. Putin about Indo-Pacific, because Minister Lavrov they've always criticized this idea of Indo-Pacific being the American initiative. But the message was thrown to Mr. Putin that this is not the case. Japan and India tried to convince Mr. Putin that this was an American thing. Mr. Putin's response was he did not criticize this initiative as being an American push. I think that was one good thing, I think. And what is needed for us to deepen this process, trying to get understanding of the leadership of the Soviet Union, of Russia.
Of Russian-Japanese startups and whether Russian startups can really function, I think that the Russian government has a very strong development agenda. So it realizes that one of the major goals is to remain competitive in the world. And the development of new type enterprises and digitalization are the means that this goal is going to be achieved. So unfortunately, there is no so much focus on small and medium enterprises' successes in the media. So we mostly talk about the big corporations, the oil and gas, or the nuclear power, for example. But they do exist, and there are successes in major cities. Moscow, first of all, and St. Petersburg are very much digitalized, and there is a certain discrepancy between the capital, the biggest cities, and the smaller cities across Russia. So there is a lot of work to do, and I hope that it will be done, because the development goals are very clear, and even though there is much red tape, there are obstacles to development of small and medium businesses. Still, Russia is improving in terms of doing business. You can look at ratings, and it's on par with some of the best performing European countries, and much better than some of its neighbors. I think the more we discuss innovation, technological improvement, the better, because Russia is not all about arms, weapons sales, and so on, which often dominates our thinking about it. Thank you.
About propaganda, there is no such propaganda, but because even without propaganda, in Russia, prevailing feeling is that Japan is under American control. That's why it's not estimation of these days. It comes from Soviet Union era, and it was always such feeling that sometimes it was such feeling what for to talk with Tokyo, it's better to start to talk with Washington, and if Washington agree, Japan will follow. So that's why in these days also there is such expressions from Russian politicians that Japan is not sovereign country in full sense, and it follows American leadership, and well, that's a matter of fact. Well, yesterday I very much was upset by expression made by Okamoto-san, who said that if something will happen in Taiwan and China will start something military intervention and America will be involved, Japan should also help America in this situation. Come on, so it's not a violation of your constitution, and what for you will be involved in such incident, which doesn't have any connection with the security of Japan. So, but it's quite a good example how deep is, how to say, pro-American feelings or dependence on America. So, well, without any propaganda, such feelings exist.
どうもありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Sorry, due to poor chairmanship, only 1 minute is left. We had such a very tough question from Ambassador Togo. But I find it rather difficult to answer the question in 1 minute. So I'd like to talk to him later, personally. I'm willing to do a kind of debate or battle with him. But I'd like to thank two wonderful Russian panelists, together with the Japanese speaker, Professor Anbel, for having such a productive and high-quality discussion. As to the question by Ambassador Togo, for one, we hope that we can meet again in this forum so that not only Japan, US, Japan, Russia, but rather larger framework, including China, India, there could be a kind of framework for dialogue for track 1.5 or track 2 for further extension. That would be beneficial for peace and stability of Asia, as well as progress of negotiation for peace treaty between Japan and Russia. Russia has been unique, both historically as well as even in modern era, and therefore, in that sense, the messages coming out of Russia are only partially understood, and they could be used as a kind of propaganda. Maybe Russia is at least partially responsible for that, but their true intention and the reality that they are faced with is something that we want you to have a deeper understanding. And that is one of the reasons why we organize this forum today. Thank you for your participation.
この後の会合に
As for the breakout sessions after this, they will take place in the one floor below. Therefore, please move to the first floor. Thank you.